Hello one and all, and welcome to the second part of my more controversial videos. In the first one we talked about diversity in fantasy and ways you can implement it without coming off as pandering. If you haven't seen that, I recommend watching it, as it will be linked into the corner right above. Though that was entirely related to original stories that you yourself are making. But what if you find yourself adapting an already existing story? How does one go about that? Well, for starters, it depends on what you're adapting and into what. Is this a book to movie, a movie to show, a show to a comic book to a movie, video game to a movie, book to a video game? Depending on the two formats, it can affect what needs to be done greatly. But to greatly simplify it, can look at these as either adding information or removing it. Movies, shows, video games, comic books, and books. Ordered from least to greatest when it comes to the amount of information. If the transition is from left to right, things need to be added. If it's right to left, then information needs to be cut. Now, this isn't always the case. You can read the entire Hobbit book before anyone could finish the movie trilogy. But most of the time, I think this idea holds true. This is a situation that almost never has a right answer, and no matter what you do, you're going to piss someone off. You might cut a chapter that to the overarching story isn't connected, but maybe someone greatly enjoyed the moment. You might expand on a side character, but people will disagree with your interpretation, finding the incident out of character. But what if in your adaptation, you do something far riskier than simply cutting or filling space? What if you completely change it? This can relate to a lot of things, from simply replacing a scene with something entirely new and different, or to change the appearance of a character. These kinds of changes seem to be the most controversial because it's changed more for artistic reasons rather than practicality, with some noticeable exceptions, specifically in live action. Now, there are a lot of things that you can change in a series, but for this video, we are going to go over appearances, and given I am more experienced with Game of Thrones, I will tackle the changes from this series, but I will sprinkle other franchises that I have also had experience with, dealing on the sensitive topic of changing the appearance of a character. Now, in the realm of live action, sacrifices have to be made, as it's hard to find someone who both perfectly resembles the character from the books and has the talent to act. Sometimes you strike gold, like with Sean Bean as Eddard Stark or Charles Dance as Tyrion Lannister. Yet other times you need to make sacrifices. A perfect example being Mark Andy as Robert and Peter Dinklage as Tyrion. Starting with Mark, there are not a lot of people who would say his portrayal of Robert is bad. But many would argue that he didn't have the build of someone like Robert. For example, Mark is 5'10", yet in the books, Robert Baratheon stands at 6.5 feet tall. So should an actor of that height be picked? I always thought that John Goodman could have probably done a decent job with the part, though even he is still too small since he is just barely over 6 feet. Maybe Brian Posehn? Not only is he the right height, but he has the build as well for an out-of-shape former great warrior. But could they bring the same acting chops and talent that Mark Andy could? Speaking of height, what about Hotah as the Mountain? At least Mark Andy was only 8 inches shorter than the book. Hotah is over a foot shorter. But casting someone accurate to the Mountain is literally impossible. Anyone tall enough is too lanky, and anyone strong and intimidating enough is too short. Peter Dinklage is another, technically, poor casting choice, yet despite him currently being on the fandom shit list for putting his foot in his mouth, no one will argue that his portrayal of Tyrion wasn't amazing, up until the end of Season 4 at least, for the most diehard book fans. But everything after that can be blamed on writing rather than his acting. However, the reason he is a poor casting choice for the role of Tyrion isn't an issue of height. No, in this case, it's on the facial appearance. You see, Tyrion in the books is ugly. Like, good God, I can see why Tywin wanted to drown him when he first laid eyes on him. But by comparison, Peter is drop-dead gorgeous. Yet that isn't the only issue when it comes to appearance, as Tyrion has mismatched eyes, green and black. Peter only has the green eyes. Where's the black? Now, this might seem like nitpicking, and to be fair, it is. I didn't even know what his actual eye color was until I began writing the script, and I am probably more forgiving on a lot of these visual issues because I was introduced to the series by the show around the end of Season 5, rather than the books. When I reread the books, it's hard to picture people aside from the actors, but that's probably just due to my anchoring bias. Speaking of eyes though, what about some of the other actors? The Targaryens in particular, like Daenerys and Viserys. A common feature of those with Velaryon ancestry is purple eyes with snow-white blonde hair, and while they make good on the hair, their eyes are noticeably not purple. Now, to be fair, they did attempt to use purple contacts, but decided against it due to it being uncomfortable for the actors. But in that case, why not just change the colors in post? Glidus, or is it Glidus? Either way, Glidus has a video going over the details of Dany and Season 1, and damn near in every scene, he changed her and Viserys' eyes to purple. And taking a quote from him, to be honest, if one self-taught dumbass can do this in Premiere, why the fuck can't HBO do it? I could keep going on. Sandor's scars is not nearly as bad in the show as it is in the books. Dario losing his blue hair and golden mustache. Syrio Forel having a lot more hair than in his book counterpart. But if I do that, we'll be here all day. As I already confessed, nitpicks these may be, but these are things that could have been fixed rather easily. Yet there are some other casting choices that cannot be quote-unquote fixed so easily. I mentioned this at the end of the first part, so let's talk about it. The casting of Corlys Velaryon, Salladhor Saan, and Areo Hotah. Each of these characters was played, or in the former case, is going to be played by a black actor. Now, before I pull up Peter Dinklage, let me just say I am not as much of a purist as a lot of people when it comes to the appearance of the source material. I know the past 6 minutes and 20 seconds might make you think otherwise, but I mainly brought those up as a way of saying if you're not a fan of changing the race of a character, then you should at least have issues with these other visual changes. I'm not like young Ripa saying that any character that has their race changed is tokenism. If it's an adaptation of something that has a modern or even future setting, then I say go for it. Black Hermione? Sure. Black Kingpin? He was the best part of the movie. Hell, the show Invincible changes half of the cast's race and some of their sexes. Yet, for me, it didn't matter because it was a modern setting and the race and sexualities of these characters were not important. Also, aside from one character, the show, I feel, is a superior story. Yet, that doesn't mean I'm ready to grab a paint bucket and hormone blockers whenever the topic of adaptation comes up, and I can be quite resistant to the idea, specifically in 3 cases. And before I go into it further, the rest of this video is not for hypocrites. If it's okay to change a white person to black, but not the other way around, no matter the context, then there is no point in having this discussion with you. First, historical stories. If a real historical character is being portrayed, even if it's in a fictional story like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the actor should reasonably resemble the former president. Imagine if we had a show about the founding fathers and casted them all as minorities, or a story about Queen Anne Boleyn and made her black. It would be ludicrous. The second is culturally important stories, like say if you're adapting the story of Hercules, he should be Greek. John Henry, black. King Arthur, white. And also a man. Fucking Japan. That isn't to say, though, the actor has to be the correct race. I think a pale Hispanic is more than capable of playing a white person. Though, naturally, you should be careful. But for the love of God, let's be reasonable and say maybe a movie about Egyptian gods shouldn't star a bunch of white people, okay? The final situation where I would push back against changing a character's race is often in stories that are set in technologically inferior settings, such as, I don't know, medieval times where people couldn't hop into a car and drive across a continent in 2 days. Take a guess where Game of Thrones falls in for me. Also, with the characters brought up, some might argue that these characters' skin color was never stated, and I am going to say that's a heaping pile of bullshit. For starters, if you read The Three Kingdoms, you might be surprised, but a lot of the characters are not described as Asian. By that logic, if I was to make an adaptation of The Three Kingdoms, I can make any of them black, white, or Hispanic if I want to, right? Of course, each of these characters mentioned actually has their ethnicity mentioned, but since there are some dark-skinned Targaryens like Baelor Targaryen, shit, why do they have so few names? The prince, not the king. There we go. Because that means black Velaryons are possible. But this proves my point, as in this example, it shows that if any of these characters were black, then George R.R. Martin would have mentioned it. These 3 characters are white. There is no argument on that front, especially since official artwork, not fan work, depicts them as white, such as the card game. Now, with that settled, let's talk about if the changing of their race actually affects the story or characters, starting with the easiest one, Salladhor Saan. For starters, in the books, he is stated to be Valyrian, but his culture is Lyseni. For me, I always interpreted it as his race is Valyrian, so he has the white skin, platinum hair, and purple eyes of Valyrian, but the style and mannerisms of someone from Lyseni. Though some seem to think that since the Lyseni are described as having bronze skin like the Dornish, that is the color of Salladhor. which I disagree with, but I bet that's mostly just to people interpreting the description in a different manner, maybe getting the two mixed up. Either way, in the show they changed him to be from the Southern Islands, but still traveling and adopting the culture of lice. And the people of the Southern Islands are known to be great sailors, so that one would become a great pirate is completely believable. Speaking of, I actually forgot about Xaro Xhoan Doxus, but he is in a similar boat, a resident of Karth where the people are described as pale. But Karth is also mentioned to be a hotspot for trade between the north, south, east, and west, so someone from the Southern Islands making a name for himself here isn't exactly unbelievable. So he is in a similar vein to Salador, where the change of his race isn't that important. And in the case of Xaro, they use it to their advantage, using the aspect of him being an outsider like Dany, making it easier for her to trust him, only for that to bite her in the ass. However, we are going to run into some issues on the topic of Areo Hotah. And look, I will start with his skin color, as honestly, that is far less egregious to me than the other parts they fucked up. So unlike Salador and Xaro, Areo is not mentioned at all as being from the Southern Islands, but let's assume that he is. That can still work, as chronologically, he is a slave from Norvos. He was actually sold into slavery by his family, but just change the location and have him moved all the way to Norvos. Sure, I can accept that. And if it was at a young age, you can still have the aspects of him getting used to the hot summer heat of Dorne and food, as despite him being from the Southern Islands, which has a similar hot climate, if a bit more humid, he wouldn't be experienced in it due to him not living there in his adult life. But for fuck's sake, he was raised and brought up in an organization called the Bearded Priests, who are famous for wrecking shit with their axes, and in walks this clean-shaven motherfucker with a goddamn glaive. At this moment, what is even the point in calling him Areo? It doesn't help that he is so heavily linked to the Dorne plot, which is a substantial pile of shit. Just, no. Everything about this adaptation just pisses me off so much that I don't even notice the difference in race. This isn't Areo on any level. They should have given him the Jane Westerling treatment and just tossed him out of the story if they had no intention of resembling the book character at all. At least I can kind of see Salador and Xaro in their adaptation. But now we get to the most recent controversial casting. Corey's Velaryon being played by Steve Toussaint. Now, to be fair, this adaptation has yet to come out, and maybe they have a way of justifying it. However, of all the families you could get away with making black, the Velaryons are not one of them. Like the Targaryens, they hail from Valyria and have a very similar culture, and thus would likely follow the same avenue of keeping the bloodline pure. And this is shown to be true considering just how much the Targaryens married into the Velaryons and vice versa. House Velaryon actually ties with the most women married to a king of the Iron Throne. The only house that beats it is Targaryen itself. Sweet home Alabama. Oh, and real fast, fun little fact, we really should stop singing that song when it comes to incest. Florida actually leads the country in that aspect, so really it should be Sweet Home Florida. Anyways, that alone would make it harder to justify making them black. But put on top that at the time, House Velaryon was the richest house in all of Westeros, beating out the Hightowers and Lannisters. To justify this family to look over their bigotry that many of the elite families have in this story, they need to be getting something amazing in return. And if such a thing happened, it would be mentioned. I mean, hell, this is a world where a brutal war started because a blonde shitty prince didn't have black hair. Still, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they can spin this in a way where it fits, like with Salador San, but I'm not going to be holding my breath on the matter. So, what can we learn about all this? Nothing. Anything you change from the source material will be hated by book purists, so let me give you this piece of advice. When you're adapting a story, just try your best to make it that, an adaptation. And if you make any changes, make sure it's for practical reasons rather than artistic ones. And if you do make changes still, get the original author on your side if they're still kicking. If you want more minority characters, then adapt their stories. You're never going to make people think of Miles Morales when you say Spider-Man, or Jane Foster when you say Thor. Make your own stories about minority characters, because it can be done. T'Challa, Bane, Mace Windu, Machete, Agent J, Voss, Blade, and this is just going into the fictional realm. If you go to historical, you can still tell the stories of Geronimo, Bruce Lee, Jack Briscoe, Louis Armstrong, Thurgood Marshall, Alexandre Dumas, Mansa Musa, and hundreds of others. Okay? I think that's about all the time I have right now, but I hope you're all safe, have a good day, and I'll see you next time.